Richmond, Virginia, October 15, 1993. The coffee was still warm when Patricia Mills' supervisor realized something was wrong. At Riverside Community Bank, Patricia had never missed a day without calling in her 22 years of employment. Her desk sat pristine, staplers aligned, family photos dusted, her reading glasses folded neatly beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. The October morning light filtered through the bank's tall windows, casting long shadows across the empty chair, where Patricia should have been counting deposits and greeting customers with her trademark smile. Patricia, 47, lived alone in a modest two-story colonial on Maple Street, just 8 blocks from the bank where she'd worked since graduating high school. Neighbors described her as reliable, quiet, and devoted to her elderly mother, who lived in a nursing home across town. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Patricia visited her mother without fail. Every Sunday, she attended First Methodist Church, sitting in the same pew, 3rd row from the front. That Tuesday morning started like any other in her routine-driven life. Mrs. Henderson, who lived next door, later told police she'd seen Patricia's blue Honda Civic backing out of the driveway at exactly 7:42 a.m., the same time Patricia left every morning. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching under tires as she drove the familiar route down Monument Avenue toward downtown Richmond. But Patricia Mills never arrived at work that day. When she failed to appear by 9 a.m., her supervisor, Janet Crawford, called Patricia's house. The phone rang and rang, echoing through empty rooms. By 10 a.m., Janet was worried enough to drive to Patricia's home. The Honda wasn't in the driveway. The front door was locked, mail still tucked in the brass slot. Everything appeared normal, yet something felt terribly wrong. The Richmond police initially treated it as a missing person case, not an emergency. Adults had the right to disappear, they reasoned. Maybe Patricia had finally decided to take that vacation she'd been talking about for years. Maybe she'd driven to the mountains for some spontaneous soul-searching. But those who knew Patricia Mills understood. This woman didn't do spontaneous. She planned her grocery shopping 2 weeks in advance. By evening, when Patricia failed to visit her mother at Sunset Manor Nursing Home, the reality set in. Patricia Mills, a creature of unwavering habit and fierce family loyalty, had vanished somewhere between her driveway on Maple Street and the bank 8 blocks away. The last person to see Patricia alive was a gas station attendant named Derek Thompson at the Shell station on Broad Street. He remembered her stopping around 8 a.m. to buy her usual cup of black coffee and a newspaper. Derek later told investigators that Patricia seemed normal, maybe a little tired, but she'd smiled and wished him a good day. She'd driven away in her blue Honda, heading east toward downtown. That Honda Civic would become the key to everything, but not for 30 years. The first weeks after Patricia's disappearance brought an avalanche of false hope and dead ends. Her blue Honda Civic was found abandoned in a Walmart parking lot 15 miles outside Richmond, keys still in the ignition, purse left on the passenger seat with her wallet, cash, and credit cards untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no blood. The car had simply been left there, as if Patricia had vanished into thin air. Police canvassed the area around the Walmart, interviewing employees and reviewing grainy security footage. Nothing. The cameras were angled toward the store entrance, not the parking lot. Dozens of people could have parked there, left their cars, and walked away unnoticed. Patricia's sister, Margaret, drove down from Philadelphia the moment she heard the news. The two women had spoken every Saturday for 20 years, sharing mundane details about their weeks, their mother's health, and Margaret's grandchildren. Margaret knew her sister's patterns better than anyone. Patricia's medicine cabinet organized by expiration date, her closets arranged by season and color, her refrigerator stocked with the same brands she'd bought for decades. She didn't just leave, Margaret told Detective Robert Hayes during one of many interviews. Patricia ironed her work clothes the night before, every night. She had ironed clothes hanging in her closet for the rest of the week. She'd written checks for her bills and left them stamped on her kitchen counter, ready to mail. This wasn't a woman planning to disappear. The investigation revealed Patricia's surprisingly solitary life. She had work colleagues, but no close friends. She attended church but sat alone. She shopped at the same grocery store, ate at the same diner once a week, and rarely deviated from established routines. This predictability, which should have made her easy to trace, instead made her disappearance more baffling. Detective Hayes, a 20-year veteran of the Richmond Police Department, had seen hundreds of missing person cases. Most resolved within 48 hours, runaways returning home, adults found safe at hospitals or with relatives. But Patricia's case gnawed at him. She had no debts, no enemies, no romantic entanglements. Her bank account remained untouched. Her medical record showed no signs of mental health issues or medications that might cause confusion. Months passed. The initial media attention faded. Search parties stopped organizing weekend volunteer efforts. Patricia's case file grew thicker with dead ends, reports of women matching her description spotted in neighboring states, all proving false, phone tips from psychics claiming to know her location, anonymous letters suggesting she'd been taken by human traffickers or had joined a religious cult. Margaret hired a private investigator, spending her retirement savings on a man who promised results but delivered only more questions. He traced Patricia's final morning in excruciating detail: the gas station stop, 3 traffic cameras that captured her Honda heading east, then nothing. The car and Patricia had simply vanished from every camera, every witness, every record for 8 hours before the Honda appeared at the Walmart. Patricia's mother, Helen, deteriorated rapidly after her daughter's disappearance. The weekly visits had been the highlight of her life, and without them she seemed to fold in on herself. Nurses at Sunset Manor noted her increasing confusion and agitation. She would ask every visitor, doctors, janitors, other residents, families, if they'd seen Patricia. Helen died 18 months after her daughter's disappearance, still waiting for answers. By 1995, Detective Hayes had been promoted and transferred to another division. Patricia's case file was relegated to the cold case archives, one manila folder among hundreds of unsolved disappearances and crimes. Richmond moved on as cities do. New tragedies replaced old ones in newspaper headlines. The bank hired a replacement for Patricia. A young family bought her house on Maple Street, but Margaret never stopped believing her sister was coming home. Every year on October 15th, the anniversary of Patricia's disappearance, Margaret would drive from Philadelphia to Richmond. She'd place flowers on their mother's grave, visit the bank where Patricia had worked, and walk the 8-block route between Patricia's old house and downtown. She'd hand out flyers with Patricia's photograph to anyone who would take them, asking if they remembered anything at all. The years stretched into decades. Margaret's hair went grey, then white. Her hands developed arthritis from stuffing envelopes with missing person flyers. But she never stopped looking for her sister. Richmond, Virginia, March 18, 2023. The sledgehammer hit concrete with a hollow thud that echoed through the basement of 412 Pine Street. Mike Rodriguez, the demolition contractor, paused and frowned. After 20 years of tearing down old houses, he knew the sound of solid foundation versus hollow space. This wasn't right. The Victorian house had been scheduled for demolition to make way for condominiums. Built in 1889, it had been abandoned for 3 years after the elderly owner died, and his estate couldn't find buyers. The basement had flooded repeatedly, leaving water stains and mold that made the property nearly worthless. Rodriguez's crew was hired to tear everything down and haul it away, but the basement wall sounded hollow where it should have been solid. Rodriguez called over his assistant, Tommy Chen, and they examined the concrete more carefully. What they'd assumed was the foundation's eastern wall appeared to have been bricked up and covered with a thin layer of concrete. Amateur work, nothing like the original 1889 craftsmanship visible in the rest of the basement. Probably just old storage space, Tommy suggested. These Victorian houses had root cellars, wine storage, all kinds of weird additions. Rodriguez nodded, but something bothered him. The concrete was wrong, too new, too thin. And why would someone brick up storage space? They broke through carefully, more curious than concerned. The first hole revealed darkness and stale air that smelled of dust and decay. Rodriguez shined his flashlight through the opening and saw a small, hidden room, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, that had been completely sealed off from the rest of the basement. And there, in the far corner, sat a blue Honda Civic. Rodriguez stared for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A car, in a sealed basement room. That was impossible. The room was too small for a car. The entrance was too narrow, yet there it was, covered in 30 years of dust but unmistakably a blue Honda Civic. "Call the police," Rodriguez told Tommy, his voice steady but tense. "Call them right now." Within an hour, the basement was swarming with Richmond police officers, crime scene technicians, and Detective Sarah Martinez, who'd inherited the cold case division along with hundreds of unsolved files dating back decades. Martinez had heard about the Patricia Mills case. Every detective in Richmond knew about it, but she'd never worked it personally. The Honda's license plate matched Patricia Mills' missing vehicle, Virginia tags, VHM 471. The car's registration and insurance documents were still in the glove compartment, but Detective Martinez found herself staring at something that defied logic. How had a full-size car ended up in a basement room that had been bricked up and concealed? The answer came when crime scene technicians examined the room more thoroughly. The Honda had been dismantled piece by piece, then reassembled inside the hidden space. Someone had taken extraordinary time and effort to hide this car completely. The doors, hood, and trunk had been removed, carried through the narrow basement stairs, then reattached. Even the tires had been deflated, removed, and reinstalled, but Patricia Mills was nowhere to be found. Inside the Honda's trunk, investigators discovered items that made Detective Martinez's stomach turn: Patricia's purse, her bank ID badge, reading glasses, and a navy blue coat that her sister Margaret would later identify as Patricia's favorite winter jacket. There was also something that chilled Martinez to the bone: a small notebook with Patricia's handwriting, documenting what appeared to be her final hours. The notebook contained 7 pages of increasingly frantic writing. Patricia had documented being followed, being afraid, being trapped somewhere dark and cold. The final entry, written in shaking handwriting, simply said, "He says no one will find me here. I don't think I'm going home." Detective Martinez held the notebook in her gloved hands and felt 30 years of questions crystallizing into a single, urgent need. Who was he? And how had Patricia Mills ended up in this impossible grave? The house at 412 Pine Street had been owned by the same family since 1962. Public records showed it had belonged to Walter and Dorothy Brennan until Walter's death in 2020. Dorothy had died 3 years later, leaving the property to their estate. But in 1993, the Brennans had a tenant living in their basement apartment, a quiet man who paid rent in cash and kept to himself. His name was Marcus Webb, and according to neighbors, he disappeared around the same time as Patricia Mills. Now, 30 years later, Marcus Webb was about to discover that some secrets don't stay buried forever. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Dorothy Brennan's personal effects, still boxed in her late son's garage in Norfolk. When Detective Martinez contacted the family about the basement discovery, Dorothy's daughter-in-law mentioned a box of her mother-in-law's papers she'd been meaning to donate to charity. Among Dorothy's belongings, Martinez found a manila envelope labeled Tenant Issues, 1993. Inside were carbon copies of handwritten notes Dorothy had made about her basement tenant, Marcus Webb. Apparently, Dorothy had been meticulous about documenting problems with renters. The notes painted a picture of growing tension between Dorothy and Marcus in the months before Patricia's disappearance. Marcus had asked repeatedly about modifying the basement, claiming he needed storage space for his woodworking hobby. Dorothy had refused, noting in her careful handwriting that Marcus gave her the creeps, and she wanted him out by Christmas 1993. More importantly, Dorothy had written down Marcus's social security number and previous address for her rental application records. Within 48 hours, Detective Martinez had tracked Marcus Webb to an assisted living facility in Newport News, Virginia, where he'd been living under his real name for the past 5 years. Marcus Webb, now 73 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia, had been hiding in plain sight for 3 decades. When Martinez arrived at Sunset Gardens Assisted Living, she found a frail, white-haired man in a wheelchair, watching television in the facility's common room. Marcus seemed confused when she introduced herself, asking repeatedly why police wanted to talk to him. But when Martinez mentioned Patricia Mills' name, something shifted in his eyes. "I don't remember any Patricia," he said, but his hands were shaking. The interview took place over several days, with a social worker present due to Marcus's cognitive condition. Martinez had to be patient, understanding that dementia had likely altered Marcus's memories, but not necessarily erased them. Sometimes the distant past remained clearer than recent events. On the 3rd day, when Martinez showed Marcus a photograph of Patricia Mills, he began to cry. "She was so scared," he whispered. "I never meant for it to go that far." The confession came in fragments, confused and sometimes contradictory, but Martinez slowly pieced together the truth. Marcus Webb had been obsessed with Patricia Mills for months before her disappearance. He'd learned her routine, followed her to work, to the grocery store, to visit her mother. He'd convinced himself that Patricia was lonely like him, that she would welcome his attention if he could just get her alone to explain his feelings. On October 15, 1993, Marcus had followed Patricia from the gas station, waited for her to park at the bank, then approached her in the parking lot. According to his fragmented confession, he'd intended to ask her for coffee, to finally introduce himself properly. But Patricia had been frightened by this stranger who knew her name and daily routine. She'd tried to get back in her car. She was going to call the police, Marcus told Martinez, his voice barely audible. I just wanted her to listen. I just wanted her to understand that I cared about her. Marcus had convinced Patricia to drive to his basement apartment, claiming he needed to call someone who could verify he wasn't dangerous. Once there, he'd locked the doors and tried to explain his months of watching her, convinced he could make her understand his feelings weren't threatening, but Patricia had been terrified. She'd demanded to leave, threatening to scream for help. Marcus, panicking and afraid of being arrested, had tied her to a chair in the basement while he tried to figure out what to do. I brought her food, Marcus said, tears streaming down his face. I thought maybe if she stayed a few days, she'd see I was a good person. I thought she'd understand. Patricia had died after 3 days. Marcus claimed it was a heart attack brought on by stress and fear, though without her remains, the exact cause would never be known. Overwhelmed by guilt and terror, Marcus had spent weeks dismantling Patricia's car and rebuilding it in the sealed basement room, along with anything that connected her to him. He'd moved Patricia's body to a location he could no longer remember. His dementia had taken those memories, then bricked up the basement room and disappeared from Richmond. For 30 years, he'd lived with the knowledge that he'd killed an innocent woman whose only crime was existing in his twisted fantasy. When Detective Martinez asked why he'd kept Patricia's car and belongings instead of destroying them, Marcus looked confused for a moment, then said something that would haunt her for years. I guess I wanted to remember her. She was the only person I ever loved. Marcus Webb was arrested on charges of kidnapping and involuntary manslaughter. Due to his age and mental condition, he would likely spend his remaining years in a medical facility rather than traditional prison. The case that had tormented Richmond police for 3 decades was finally closed, though Patricia Mills' body was never recovered. Margaret, now 82 years old, attended every day of Marcus Webb's brief court proceedings. When asked by reporters how she felt about finally knowing the truth, she simply said, Patricia was afraid, and she died alone. That's not justice. That's just an ending. The house at 412 Pine Street was torn down as planned. Where the basement once stood, there's now a small memorial garden with a bench dedicated to Patricia Mills. Sometimes Margaret visits, sitting on the bench and talking quietly to her sister. After 30 years of searching, she finally knows where Patricia spent her last days. But some questions will never be answered. Patricia Mills deserved to grow old, to retire from her job at the bank, to see her sister's grandchildren graduate from college. Instead, she became the victim of a lonely man's delusion, a woman whose predictable life made her an easy target for someone who confused obsession with love. The case closed on March 25, 2023. Patricia Mills was 47 years old when she disappeared. She would have been 77 years old when her killer was finally caught. The truth had been buried in a basement for 30 years, waiting for a demolition crew to accidentally swing their sledgehammer in just the right place. Sometimes justice arrives not through brilliant detective work or dramatic confessions, but through the simple act of tearing down walls and letting light into dark places where secrets have been hidden too long. Patricia Mills' story reminds us that behind every cold case file is a person who deserved better, a family that never stopped looking, and a truth that refuses to stay buried forever.